by talking about prison reform, it's going to immediately show the futility of trying to divide Bayard's work up into categories. It is practically impossible to talk about any part of Bayard's work without also talking about the whole. He is the intersectional man. He's Black, Quaker, gay, war resistor, internationalist, Gandhiist, champion of the poor, civil rights advocate. He was all of these things, all of his adult life, not in sequence, not seriatim. These were not a mixture of separate projects. They are all part of an undifferentiated vision of social justice and what he identified as his Christian ideals. Bayard was a brilliant strategist. He always knew where all the pieces, all of these issues were on the chessboard. And before he made a move, he had already thought 3, 4, 5 steps ahead. But these strategies were never mere machinations. They are in service to a vision of social justice that is deeply spirit-led. He embodies for me the idea that there are not separate Quaker testimonies, just capital T testimony, living a life true to God's calling to us. And so while we on the Quaker Education Committee have divided Bayard's life up into topics, I want to remind us all that he never did. Bayard had 3 major incarcerations that shaped his life and vision. One, when he was jailed for being a war resistor. Second, when he was arrested for resisting Jim Crow transportation laws. And third, in 1953, when he was arrested for lewd behavior in California for being in a sexual situation with a man in a car. I'm not going to talk about that third one, not because it isn't important, but because it's going to be addressed as part of a discussion of his identity and his work in the LGBTQ community. So I'm going to start with the first incarceration, and I'm going to ask something a little different. I'm going to say to all of you here, do you know someone 28 years old to 31 years old? If you do, I want you to picture that person in your mind, think about what you think about that person, and then recognize that's the age that Bayard was during the events that I'm now going to talk about. So, World War II has started. The draft has been enacted. Traditional peace churches have created an alternative form of service for those whose religious convictions would not allow them to fight. These conscientious objectors would respond to the draft, make a case for their CO status, and go off to work in alternative service supervised by these church groups. Bayard, at 28, submitted his documentation for CO status. He talked about his history among Quakers, his Quaker upbringing, and then his joining of the society. Now, a backdrop to this is that there were war resistors in prisons already making headlines. During World War II, 1 in 6 federal prisoners was a war resistor. These men were organized, educated, and very unlike most prisoners in federal prisons. They were protesting for better prison conditions. They were fasting, being forced fed. They were making headlines. Bayard heard about them, and it started to change his mind about applying for CO status. So in 1943, now 31, Bayard gets his notice to report for the draft. In response, he wrote a letter to the draft board formally withdrawing his request for CO status and returning his draft card. He stated that he had come to believe the same principles that required him to resist war required him to reject conscription as a whole, and thus he would refuse to be drafted even into alternative service. He supplied a copy of this letter to the U.S. attorney, and he turned himself in. He was arrested, pled guilty, and was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. We immediately see an example of how he doesn't ever take a single issue stance. Between applying to be a CO and deciding to resist and go to prison, he had to think about what the purpose of going to prison would be. He was apprehensive about going to prison. He consulted with others. We would say he tested his leading to go to prison. And he recognized that if he was going to go, he wasn't going to look at this action only in terms of the peace testimony. If he was going to prison, he was going to do more than just avoid going to war. And when he considered what else he would do, he said, I'm not going to get into anything that just wants to change the food or change the diet. I want to do something that's going to mean something, something that will change society. And that something was to systematically attack and resist segregation and all it stood for in the federal prison system. The system was not ready for this 31-year-old dedicated, intellectual, focused, good troublemaker. And his actions eventually got him classified as one of the prison system's notorious offenders, along with Al Capone. It started even before he got to prison. So during his 10 days in the local jail before he was transferred to prison, Bayard went straight to work by refusing to sit at segregated dining tables in the jail. He already caught the attention of the Bureau of Prisons in Washington. The first thing that they had to deal with was where to send him. They didn't want to send him to one of the big prisons where the COs were already engaged in protests. So they sent someone to interview him to decide his placement. And when the interviewer asked if he would walk away from a minimum security prison, he said it would depend. In fact, he flipped the script from this being about him to about the prison system, and said it would depend on the treatment of the Black prisoners and on the openness of the warden to change conditions. By the end of the transcript, the exasperated interviewer said, the subject then went into a dissertation on philosophical concepts pertaining to mind, matter, theories, etc. The question was completely evaded. He was assigned to a high security prison. The warden there, it was in Ashland, Kentucky, and the warden there was a medical doctor who had a reputation as being liberal. Bayard immediately stirred up trouble. Newly admitted prisoners were kept in isolation cells before joining the general population. Rustin quickly learned that the prisoners had set up a communication system of talking through the ventilation shafts. He started providing advice on a concerted campaign against a particularly disliked guard and how to press for the freedom of a CO being held in isolation. Then Rustin, who had a beautiful and compelling voice, began to sing. As described by the incredulous guard in a letter to the Bureau of Prisons, quote, he shared a song about the lovely natural scenes and scented air from the flowers of Louisiana. The song ended in tragedy of a human body with bulging eyes being hanged and the air filled with the stench of burning flesh. Yes, evidently Bayard had sung Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit through the ventilation system. It was a song with which the guard seemed unfamiliar and was loudly applauded by the Black inmates. A few days later, while he was still in quarantine, he sent the warden a several-page memo on racial segregation, neatly outlined with the points numbered. Not only did he set out a theoretical attack on the morality of segregation, he also proposed steps to be taken to break down segregation and the racism that it engendered. He proposed placing some well-trained Black prisoners in roles that would provide to the white prisoners, quote, a tacit challenge to create thinking about race relations, end quote. He asked to teach US history both to the Black prisoners and the white prisoners. He also included a discussion of the practice of nonviolence and outlined to the warden the, quote, range of possible responses to injustice, from violence, acceptance, and avoidance to nonviolent resistance. Now, think about this for a minute. This is a 31-year-old, freshly admitted prisoner. He writes a memo on segregation, nonviolence, and acceptable responses to injustice to the warden. To me, this is the core of Bayard Rustin. This is his exercise of radical equality. He wrote respectfully and directly to a person in charge and spoke to him not as an inferior or as a supplicant, but as an equal. And yet, this had to seem like a direct threat to the principle of hierarchy on which the prison was based. And it kind of blew the warden's mind. The warden did not know how to deal with this guy. And he asked immediately, almost, for him to be transferred. And I'm going to read part of the letter he wrote to Mr. Bennett, the head of the Bureau of Prisons. I have talked at some length with Bayard Rustin. His conversation is largely concerned racial relations and followed very closely in trend the statement prepared by him, which I am enclosing. I am convinced that Rustin is an extremely capable agitator whose ultimate objective is to discredit the Bureau of Prisons. His motives are well camouflaged, with many references to his desire to bring about desired changes in racial relations through patient understanding. He possesses in abundance the rare quality of leadership. The radical conscientious objectors turned to him instinctively because of his reputation, but also it is quite evident that he has the ability to recruit followers from among inmates who might ordinarily be hostile to his announced intentions. The institution had been running along quite smoothly with no upheavals and no worse than passive compliance by Negroes and COs, until Rustin arrived here. Well, he was not transferred. Rustin wore them down. He did teach his American history class to white inmates, and there was a concession in the direction of desegregation. The gate that separated the Black area from the white common recreation areas was left open during the recreational times. Any Black inmates could go use the white facilities now. But in practice, only Rustin went through, and he did it on Sunday evenings to listen to a symphony broadcast with the white inmates. No one minded much except for one prisoner, a man named Huddleston, called Judge Huddleston, who had been some kind of elected official on the outside. This man was outraged at the disregard of segregation. He was so incensed that he attacked Rustin with a club about the size and shape of a broomstick, beating him on the head. The other white COs tried to intervene on his behalf, but Bayard told them to stay back. He just covered his head with his arms and repeated, "You can't hurt me." And then Huddleston started to beat on the others, but they followed Rustin's example. Finally, the stick just broke. There was a piece big enough left to continue the beating, but he just stopped. As one of the other COs wrote, he was so completely defeated and unnerved by the display of nonviolence, and he began shaking all over and sat down. Guards arrived, summoned by the Black inmates who had heard the commotion. Rustin suffered a broken wrist. Others had bumps and bruises. Bayard insisted that Huddleston not be punished. And there was a truce of sorts sorts, where Huddleston said he would not act violently, and Rustin said he wouldn't visit the White Common Room when Huddleston was there. But this event was transformational. The news of it spread throughout the inmates. The white COs involved gained in stature among the Black inmates. The Black inmates just didn't believe that a white man would actually intervene on behalf of a Black man until it happened. And Huddleston actually apologized to Rustin for blaming him for the fight and thanked him and the other COs for their restraint in their response to him. Bayard seamlessly incorporated this unanticipated, vicious attack into his peace and justice work in the prison. In the wake of the violence, the warden met with those involved and congratulated them, saying that it raised in the minds in all the institution respect for Negroes and for the methods by which conscientious objectors face violence and try to win justice. Moreover, looking ahead to the next move on the chessboard, he saw that by holding to their principles, they had emerged with substantial moral capital. The attack, he wrote, placed us in a position where we could ask the administration to maintain a firm and progressive position on racial policy in the prison. There seemed to be great momentum building for even more work to break down segregation in the prison when it came to a sudden and painful halt. Not for the last time, Bayard's sexuality created a controversy that almost derailed the process that he had set in motion. He was accused of having sexual relations with another prisoner. Here was another intersectionality that Bayard dealt with his whole adult life. He never denied that he was gay, but he struggled with being true to himself, with the integrity testimony, if you will, given the impact that it had on the effectiveness of his work. And that'll be covered later in our series. Nevertheless, he was not defeated. And when he was released after 28 months in prison, he once again sought a way to engage. Months after his release, the Supreme Court had issued its decision in which it declared that segregation in interstate transportation was unconstitutional. Almost immediately, those seeking social justice recognized that this case was just not being followed. And the major bus lines told their employees to obey the restrictions in the Jim Crow states without distinguishing whether travel was intrastate, where the Jim Crow laws still applied, or interstate, where it did not. One bus driver reportedly said, "I work for the bus company, not for the Supreme Court." Bayard and other young members of the new organization, CORE, made a plan to ride buses to expose the continuation of segregation. This action was undertaken 15 years before the freedom rides of the 1960s. It was called the Journey of Reconciliation. And as with other actions to come, Bayard's planning for this was detailed and strategic, with an eye not only on the protest itself, but in recording and reporting the experience. The riders kept records of the travel and arrests, and not just the dramatic ones that made headlines. Now, the law on this interstate travel was very clear. And despite arrests and short stays in jail, the cases were basically thrown out, except one. Bayard was on a trip through North Carolina when he was arrested, and their lawyer, through incompetence or subversion, lost the bus tickets involved, and so they were unable to prove that the men had purchased interstate transportation. The judge found them guilty of violating the Jim Crow restrictions and sentenced Bayard to 30 days in a prison camp on a chain gang. Unlike his time in Ashland, this was not part of a plan. Yet he approached it open to ways that he could learn, teach, and effect change. This is how I think of Bayard, always open to leadings in whatever circumstances he was placed. Now, this camp was no federal prison. It was a segregated camp based on exploitive, hard labor and meant specifically to break down the inmates. There was no charade that this was for rehabilitation. If they could create repeat offenders, that was a plus. More free labor to build and maintain state roads. And this group were ready for him. On the first day that he arrived, a guard waved a newspaper article in his face in front of others and said, "You're the one who thinks he's smart, ain't got no respect, tries to be uppity. Well, we'll learn ya. You'll learn you gotta respect us down here. You ain't in Yankee land no more. We don't like no Yankee ways." It was clear that the tactics that he had used in Ashland were not going to work here. His ministry, his work here, became much less overtly political. Instead, it recognized and attacked what he saw as the primary evil of prison, the brutalization and dehumanization of the prisoners, and also the effect of that process on the guards. So he undertook a kind of two-sided strategy. On the one hand, reaching out to inmates and guards inside the prison, and on the other, exposing the evils of the system to the outside world. And while that last part, the report on the prisons to the outside world, got a lot of attention, I want to highlight the first part. As to his inside strategy, he turned 180 degrees from his confrontational, if nonviolent, attack on the system that he had used in Ashland. He knew that the warden and the guards expected him to shirk, be difficult, and defy authority. And instead, he adopted a completely different tactic. He said, "I wanted to work hard so that I would not be a burden to the other chain gangers. I wanted to accept the imprisonment in a quiet, unobtrusive manner. Only in this way, I believed, could the officials and the guards be led to consider sympathetically the principle on which I was convicted. I did not expect them to agree with me, but I did want them to believe I cared enough about the ideals I was supposed to stand for so that I could accept my punishment with a sense of humor, fair-mindedness, and goodwill." Now, his life had little in common with those of his fellow prisoners, but he treated them with respect, and he did not set himself apart from them. He recognized here, even more than at Ashland, the purpose of the system was to debase the prisoners and to dehumanize them. He refused to lower his expectation of his fellows or absorb the attitudes of the guards. A striking example for me was how he reacted to the endemic petty theft among the prisoners. Unlike the others housed with him, Bayard had outside resources from friends that kept him supplied with little luxuries like stamps, toiletries, snacks, a fountain pen, writing paper, some money. He kept those in a locked strongbox, but he saw items were disappearing from it anyway. And instead of seeing that this theft was going to just naturally continue and try to protect his goods from further harm, what he did was set up what he called the community kit. This was a box in which he put all of his possessions, and then he explained to his fellows that the contents were available to all as they needed it. He only asked that he be consulted before someone took anything. And then he just let the box be available. The result was, 1, after a week, except for 4 candy bars, there was no stealing from the community kit. 2, other men made contributions to the community kit. 3, inmates began to unlock their unsafe strong boxes and bring things to the open community kit for safekeeping. As one of the fellows said, If anyone is caught snatching from that box, the boys won't think much of him. And 4, 2 packages of cigarettes were stolen from a chain ganger. Then it was announced that unless they turned up, money would be taken from the community kit to pay for them. The cigarettes were found on the floor the next morning. Bayard also did something amazingly close to the early Quaker rejection of the hat honor. Prisoners were supplied with hats to use while they were working, but they were expected to tip their hats to the guards and to remove them as soon as they passed the gate back into the compound, and they could be punished if they violated either of those rules. Bayard simply refused to wear a hat. He explained to his fellows that he considered the tipping policy to be degrading, and he told them, "My first concern was what the tipping did to them inside." Even more remarkable to me was his behavior to the guards. As he outlined in his aims, he viewed his time here as a witness to his principles, and over he refused to demonize the guards who were trying to brutalize him. 2 quick stories. On the first day, he angered a guard by not being very good at this new work and by not calling him sir. And the guard lashed out in anger and hit another prisoner. A few days later, against the advice of his fellow prisoners, he decided that he would talk to the guard. I stopped the captain that morning and asked to speak with him. He seemed startled. I told him that I knew there were great differences in our attitudes on many questions, but I felt we could be friends. I said that on that first morning when I failed to address him as sir, I had meant no disrespect to him. And if he felt that I had been disrespectful, I was willing to apologize. I suggested that perhaps I was really the one who deserved to be beaten in the face, if anyone did. I was willing to work as hard as I could, and if I failed again in my work, I hoped he would speak to me about it, and I would try to improve. Finally, I said I could not help trying to act on the basis of my own Christian ideals about people, but that I did try to respect and understand those who differed from me. He continued to surprise the captain. When given a ration of cigarettes, he tried to return them because he didn't smoke. The captain said they were his whether he smoked or not, and Bayard immediately gave them to another prisoner. This impressed the guard. And toward the end of his stay, the guard said, "You got a surprise, didn't you? You thought we were going to mistreat you, but bad, didn't you?" Bayard said he had not known what to expect, but he had learned a great deal here. And the guard said, "Well, we can all learn something." And that afternoon, the guard treated all the workers on his gang to sodas. When it came to a close, Bayard didn't, when his time in the prison came to a close, Bayard did another remarkable thing. He wrote a letter to the same captain. And I just want to read the whole thing. It's amazing. "Dear Captain Jones, if all goes well, I understand that I may be released this coming Wednesday morning. But before I go, I want to say that I am pleased to have been placed in your work crew. Never having done similar work before, I'm afraid I was not very apt. And so all the more I want to thank you for all the help you gave me on the job. I feel that I learned a great deal. I want to thank you and Captain Duncan for the treats, cigarettes, and soft drinks. As you probably know better than I do, life has not always been easy for most of the men who come to this camp. And such kindness means more to us than words can express. I trust that your cold will have cleared up." And as usual, Bayard's person-to-person ministry was seamlessly knit into public action. As soon as he was released from prison, he was immediately taken to campus at Chapel Hill to give a speech on his experience. Now remember, Unlike with draft resistance, this incarceration was not part of the original strategy. He had just been on a chain gang for 22 days, and the day that he's released in the evening, he gives a speech. It was so graphic that it inspired the faculty at the university to form an ad hoc group to press the governor for reforms, and they asked him to write a report. And he produced that report in a few short weeks. It was published in serialized form in the New York Post and the Baltimore African American, causing a writer at the Baltimore Sun to write to Bayard, when non-professional writers produce a manuscript as vivid as yours, I feel like throwing away my typewriter and going back to plumbing. Again, we see Bayard's clear understanding of the way that all of the pieces fit. The relationship of direct action protest to social change. One of his friends at the Fellowship of Reconciliation magazine asked him if he thought how much credit he thought the organization should take for what happened, or whether the reforms were even worth claiming. Rustin responded, "The idea was to show our membership that the general effect of our journey, that's the journey of reconciliation, was not merely protest, but the development of a report that did get published in the North, that was read in the South, that the governor did read, and that a Southern committee did use behind closed doors. To show our membership that we work not only as a protest to injustice, but as part of the constructive efforts to bring gradual and basic reform. This kind of material can do a great deal to educate our membership, or at least that segment which looks upon direct action as troublemaking, period." The faculty committee did get the report to the governor, and it resulted in an overhaul of disciplinary actions in the North Carolina prisons. But this report on the prison system is also a documentation of nonviolent direct action and the Quaker belief that there is that of God in everyone, the debased prisoners from whom he might have separated himself as superior, and the brutal guards who he saw were also injured by the system. He treated each as having a spirit inside them that would respond to respect and love. The stories that he chose to tell in this report cover not only the horrific and headline-producing physical abuse of the prisoners, but also address their basic humanity, the need for recreation facilities, the futility of using hard labor to deal with mental illness, and most of all, the brutalizing effect on prisoners of a system that denies them their humanity. He said, "To me, the most degrading condition of the job was the feeling, I am not a person. I am a tool to be used." So I hope that gives you a lot to think about.